I was attracted to a handsome guy at the party. My boyfriend was standing right next to me and did not even realize the other guy was flirting with me, so careless in every way. Then he got angry just because I called him my best friend in front of that guy. The day Luca told me the man from the interview had looked him in the eye and said he couldn't hire someone who flirts with his own son's girlfriend, I felt my blood run cold. Not because I suddenly understood everything I had caused, but because for the first time I saw my name was involved in an office conversation where I never thought it would matter. He was sitting across from me with his visa depending on that job, and he was basically explaining that because of one sentence of mine at a party, his future in this country had gone down the drain. As I listened to him, the only thing repeating in my head was that it couldn't be that serious, that someone had to be exaggerating, that somewhere in the story an important nuance had been missed. Luca was furious. Alejandro had disappeared from my life, and I was left in the middle, pointed out as the common problem, and all supposedly because of one night when I just wanted to feel desired again. Before getting to that point, before interviews, visas, and companies, it was just a party and a decision that in my head was going to have no real importance. At least that's how it all started for me. I've always known I can get attention when I want to. Alejandro used to tell me he loved the way I'd walk into a room, that it seemed like everything arranged itself around me. We had been together for 2 years with a routine that for many would be perfect. He'd pick me up after work. We'd watch shows, we'd go out occasionally with his group or mine. We'd visit his family on some Sundays. He wasn't a bad boyfriend at all. He was attentive, consistent, responsible. But there was something inside me that felt the excitement was fading, that there were no more surprises, that everything was too secure. I started to feel as if I had gone from being the protagonist to a supporting character in my own life. That's why when some friends invited us to a birthday party in a big venue with a DJ, lights, and a lot of people we didn't know, I saw it almost as a breath of fresh air. I bought a new tight dress. I did my hair with more dedication than usual. I put on makeup as if I were going to a photo shoot, and I wore an expensive perfume I saved for special occasions. As I looked in the mirror, I thought I wanted to check if I could still draw looks, if I was still capable of igniting something in a place full of strangers. It wasn't that I didn't love Alejandro, I just felt I needed to know that the rest of the world still reacted to me. At the party, he behaved as usual. He was making sure I had everything I needed. He brought me drinks, he greeted people, he laughed with his friends. I moved between groups, saying hi here and there, but I had that subtle anxiety that something interesting had to happen. At one point, Alejandro said he was going to the bathroom, and I was left alone at the bar, playing with the straw in my glass and checking my phone. That's when Luca appeared as if out of an ad, tall with fair skin, striking eyes, and a foreign accent I couldn't place at first. He made a comment in English about the line for drinks. I answered in Spanish. He mixed words. We laughed. The conversation sparked on its own. Luca told me he hadn't been in the country for long, that he was just getting to know people, that he hardly ever went out because he didn't know where to go. I felt that silly little pride of being the local person who could guide him, as if I had suddenly become some kind of exotic guide for him. He made jokes, he looked at me directly, he leaned in a little closer to hear me better over the music. You could feel that spark you don't experience every day. In the middle of that, I noticed out of the corner of my eye that Alejandro had come back from the bathroom and had positioned himself next to me with his drink in his hand. He didn't make a scene, he didn't push anyone, he didn't pull me, he just stood there, close, like someone marking their presence without needing to say it. I, however, felt it as an invasion of that little universe that had been created with Luca. I thought he didn't trust me, that it bothered him to see me having fun with someone else, that he was ruining a moment when I finally felt something different. Luca, with all the politeness in the world, looked at him and in broken Spanish asked who he was. That second felt incredibly long. At that moment, I had two paths. I could react obviously and introduce him as my boyfriend, making everything clear from the start, or I could smooth over the situation so nothing would break. I didn't want the energy with Luca to die down, so I did what seemed most practical at that moment. I smiled and replied that Alejandro was my best friend, that he always came with me everywhere. I used a light, almost joking tone as if I were saying something with no real weight. I felt a small pang inside, but I ignored it. Luca relaxed immediately. His body language made it very clear. In his head, the potential conflict disappeared, and I was available without strings attached. He went back to focusing on the conversation with me, asking me things, making comments about the music and the city. Alejandro, on the other hand, stood silent for a few seconds. I saw him out of the corner of my eye but didn't pay much attention, believing he'd get over it, that he'd understand it was all a way not to cut the conversation short. When I finally looked at him straight on, I saw his eyes were glossy and his jaw was tight. He carefully placed his glass on a nearby table and, without raising his voice, said that if I was introducing him as a friend, then he hoped that friend would be the one taking me home that night. He didn't say it with irony or in a joking tone. It was a simple, almost cold conclusion from someone who knows they've been erased. Then he turned around and walked towards the exit of the venue. I watched him walk away through the crowd. Instead of going after him, the first thing I thought was that he was being overly dramatic. In my mind, it was still just a phrase, a quick move to not kill the magic of the moment. I took my phone out of my purse, intending to text him something, but first I checked if I had any messages from him. There were a couple asking where I was, telling me he was on his way, normal things. I sent him a text saying we could talk later, that he shouldn't make a drama, that he was taking things too seriously. There was no reply. I waited a few minutes, looked towards the door, didn't see him come back. Then, instead of going after him, I turned to Luca and let the night continue its course. We danced, we drank, we talked about his country, his plans, how little he knew of the city. He seemed delighted with everything. Everything seemed new and special to him, and I fed off that gaze. I felt alive again, as if I had been given back a leading role I thought was dormant. Thoughts about Alejandro would pop up now and then, but I pushed them to the back of my mind with the idea that he also needed to learn not to make scenes. In my head, he was paying the price for being too sensitive, not for something really serious that I had done. When the party ended, there were only a few of us left. I ordered a taxi from the door. Luca offered to wait with me until the car arrived. He asked if it was okay for us to keep talking another day. I said yes, that I didn't see why not. At no point did I say I had a boyfriend or that the situation with Alejandro was unresolved. I left it in that sort of comfortable limbo where no one asks difficult questions. I got into the taxi with a mix of exhaustion, an inflated ego, and a very low, almost non-existent guilt. When I got home, I checked my phone again. No messages from Alejandro. I went in, took off my makeup halfway, put on my pajamas, and collapsed on the bed. I thought about texting him again, but I told myself it was better to let him cool off and not feed his supposed scene. I fell asleep with the feeling that the problem was more about how he interpreted things than about what I had actually done. In my internal narrative, I was the one who had kept the situation under control, the one who had avoided a direct conflict at the party. The following days were a confirmation that he was not willing to budge. My messages went unanswered. My calls were not picked up. The profile picture was still there. The blue check marks would appear occasionally, but not a single word came through. I started to feel anger over concern. I thought that if he really loved me, he wouldn't throw everything away over a phrase said in a specific context. I began to repeat out loud to my friends that I was seeing his true character, that he was proud, that he didn't know how to handle a minimally uncomfortable situation, that he was punishing me instead of talking. Luca, on the other hand, did right. He'd send messages asking how I was, send a photo of the city, tell me he was trying to adapt. That difference began to reinforce in me the idea that Alejandro wasn't on my emotional level. In a short time, what had been a 2-year relationship started to seem like something old, rigid, compared to the novelty that this foreigner represented, who looked at me as if I were the key piece of his new life. I myself pushed that comparison, convinced that it justified everything that was happening. Whenever someone mentioned Alejandro or asked about him, I'd reply with the same phrase, that he had left the party without talking, that he couldn't stand me having male friends, that he had exaggerated everything over a comment. I never said that I had denied him as my boyfriend in front of another guy. I simply said the situation had been misinterpreted. So, little by little, I adjusted the story so that what I did sounded like an innocent misunderstanding and his actions a disproportionate reaction. I repeated that version so many times that I started to believe it completely, not imagining that that night at the party, which for me was just an impulse to not kill the vibe, was going to connect with things I couldn't even see on the other side. Comments. Anonymous user 1 says, "You paint Alejandro as exaggerating, but you yourself say you erased him as your boyfriend in front of a stranger while he was standing right there. That's not a silly phrase, it's denying the relationship to his face so you can keep flirting. You don't have to scream or throw glasses for something to hurt. Sometimes the damage comes precisely from how silent it was." OP's response. No one's saying it couldn't have hurt him, but I'm not going to turn a comment into an epic betrayal. If I had wanted to cheat on him, I wouldn't have even brought him to the party with me. We were in a social context with music, with new people, and I took a quick way out to not kill an interaction that was being pleasant. He could have waited for us to talk later instead of leaving like a silent martyr and disappearing. Anonymous user 2 says, "It's striking how at all times you position yourself as someone who keeps the situation under control when in reality you were the one who caused the conflict. He didn't make a scene, he left. You were the one who decided to continue the night as if nothing happened, dance, flirt, and immediately start building a new story. Then you're surprised he's no longer interested in answering you." OP's response. Going after him and being dramatic wasn't going to solve anything either. At that moment, I felt that if he made the decision to leave without saying anything else, it was because he wasn't willing to handle a minimal discomfort. I wasn't going to ruin an entire night for that. And him not answering later, well, that also says a lot about his ability to communicate. All the weight can't fall on me as if he didn't make his own decisions. Anonymous user 3 says, "You talk about checking if you still attract people as if the people around you are accessories to inflate your ego. Alejandro, whom you claim to love, is reduced to a support system that accompanies you, and Luca is a sort of new toy to prove something to yourself. No one in your story matters in their own right, only in how they make you feel." OP's response. I'm not going to deny I needed to feel desired, but that doesn't mean I saw everyone as objects. Alejandro knew my insecurities perfectly well. He knew that sometimes I needed a bit of external validation, and he never said anything as long as it stayed at looks or comments. With Luca, things just happened, and I reacted in the moment. It's very easy to judge from the outside, but when you're in it, you move with what you have, not with a perfect script of how you should behave. Update 1. When Alejandro stopped answering my messages, at first I thought it was a passing tantrum. I told myself I'd give him a couple of days to calm down, and then he'd come back as always with that calm tone, saying he didn't want to fight. But those days passed, and the silence remained there, heavy. The texts were left on read or not even opened. The calls were cut off or went straight to voicemail. Instead of seeing it as a sign that something had truly broken, I chose to read it as proof that he wasn't up to my level. I thought that a man who truly loved me wouldn't throw away a 2-year relationship just because I had softened a comment at a party. From that logic, he was the one failing, not me. Meanwhile, Luca filled that space effortlessly. We started seeing each other almost daily. He'd write to me in broken Spanish, mixing in English words. He'd invite me for coffee in small places because he said he liked discovering new spots with me. He told me he was from Europe, that he had come with just enough savings and a temporary visa that depended on him finding a job soon. He talked about how hard it had been to leave everything behind, the pressure of not being able to fail because he didn't have a plan B. I listened to him, and without saying it out loud, I felt I was being the protagonist of his new life. There was something about that role of being the person who appears just when someone is starting from scratch that fed much more than my superficial ego. Luca talked about his plans with an enthusiasm that made everything seem grand. He said that if he got a job here, he could later bring a friend who wanted to learn the language well, that he'd love to see other parts of the country. Every time he mentioned the future, I saw myself included there, as if it were obvious we would still be together when that happened. He told me he had a very important interview at a big company, that it was the opportunity that could define whether he stayed or was forced to go back. He described it almost like the final scene of a movie, entering the building, important boss, contract on the table. I looked at him and felt that his story was leveling up just by the fact that I was listening to it. In the midst of all that, I never again mentioned Alejandro as anything other than a closed chapter. When Luca asked about him the first time, I told him that Alejandro was a friend with whom things had cooled off and that there was no point in delving into it. I simplified a 2-year relationship into a vague bond to avoid getting into uncomfortable details. It seemed unnecessary to confess that the guy he had seen at the party next to me was my boyfriend and that I had decided to introduce him as a friend. For me, what mattered was the now, not what had been before. So I used that as an excuse to keep the story as clean as possible in my favor. There was a day at a cafe when Luca told me about the interview with a mix of nerves and hope that was almost endearing. He said it was his only real chance, that if he didn't get in there, it would be very difficult to find something at the same level, that the visa clock was ticking. He took my hand across the table and told me it gave him peace of mind to know that after the interview, he'd be able to text me and tell me how it went, that it made him feel not so alone in a country where he still had no roots. I nodded, I listened, I told him everything would be fine. I felt again in that role of the accidental heroine who arrives just when someone is risking something important. At no point did it occur to me that this company could have anything to do with Alejandro. I didn't even connect last names or sectors, nothing. For me, the world was compartmentalized. On one side, the life that was already fading with Alejandro. On the other, the new movie that was starting with Luca, where I was a key piece. That the two might touch at some point wasn't in my equation, so I didn't see the need to anticipate anything or adjust my role in that story to prevent consequences. From where I was standing, everything was still a matter of emotions, not of things as concrete as contracts, papers, or visas. Comments from Update 1. Anonymous User 1 says, "It's impressive how you describe Luca's life as if it were a script in which you have the role of emotional protagonist, but you completely omit that he is betting his real stability while you play at feeling alive. Not once do you consider what would happen if your lie at the party crossed paths with his concrete plans." OP's response. He himself decided to come with just enough savings and without a support network. I didn't bring him here forcing him. Obviously, I empathize with the difficulty of his situation. That's why I listened to him, I accompanied him, and I was there. But I'm not going to carry the idea that everything that happens in other people's lives depends exclusively on me and every word I say. I was also dealing with a breakup and my own stuff. I wasn't his legal representative. Anonymous User 2 says, "The most revealing thing is that you turn Alejandro into a closed chapter because he doesn't answer, and from there you decide he doesn't deserve any explanation. Instead of seeing the silence as a clear boundary, you use it as an excuse to act as if he had never been your boyfriend. That's not moving on, that's erasing the other person from the story because he makes you uncomfortable." OP's response. If someone decides to disappear without responding even once, how much am I supposed to keep dragging their label around? I tried to talk, he shut down. At some point, for mental health, one also has to assume that person doesn't want to be there and move on with their life. I don't think it's fair to be expected to respect a place he himself left empty without showing his face. Anonymous User 3 says, "You say you didn't connect last names or sectors, as if it were impossible to imagine that your life and Alejandro's had links beyond the party. The problem isn't that you didn't know it was his father's company, it's that you never bothered to consider that your parallel scenarios could collide. You lived as if nothing had consequences beyond how it made you feel." OP's response. Honestly, I didn't have a mental map of Alejandro's family or all their business connections. I knew his dad as the gentleman I saw at Sunday lunches, not as a businessman with tentacles everywhere. The fact that it turned out to be the exact company where Luca applied was a brutal coincidence, but a coincidence nonetheless. I'm not going to pretend I could have anticipated something like that. Update 2. The day of Luca's interview dawned with that strange energy of a person who's risking something big. He texted me early saying he was on his way, that he was nervous but confident, that he had gone over the typical answers 1,000 times. I replied wishing him luck, telling him I saw him as capable of convincing anyone. During the morning, every time I looked at the clock, I thought about how much longer his meeting would be if he had already gone in, if he was waiting in the reception. I sent another short message mid-morning to remind him he was going to nail it, like a sort of good luck charm. I kept my phone close, waiting for the notification that would tell me how everything had gone. The hours started to pass, and the enthusiasm began to mix with irritation. Noon came, and there wasn't a single reply. I thought maybe the interview had gone long, that perhaps they had moved him to a second round, that he was busy. At 3 in the afternoon, I texted him again, asking how it went, telling him I was waiting. Nothing. At 6, the silence was still the same, and that's when I started to get really annoyed. I told myself that for all the excitement he had built up about the job, he couldn't even bother to send a quick message, that it showed that deep down I was less of a priority than he had sold me. Every couple of hours, I'd look at the screen again out of habit, and I'd see the same thing, my sent messages with no reply. There were no photos or audios or anything. I started to overthink everything. If he had regretted going out with me, if he had realized something, if a disaster had happened. But instead of staying in a state of worry, I was overcome by pride. I thought that if he wanted to, he could text me, that it wasn't that hard to send a sentence saying he'd tell me the details later. By the end of the day, the silence was no longer a mystery, it was an offense. It wasn't until around 10 at night that a message from him appeared. It wasn't an audio message detailing everything or a cheerful sentence saying it had all gone perfectly. It was a short, dry text asking to meet the next day because there was something important to talk about. The tone hit me like a bucket of cold water. It didn't sound like celebration or joy, it sounded like a problem. I replied that it was fine, that we could meet in the square near my house, the same one where we used to sit and talk about his plans. I closed the chat with a weird feeling, like when you know something has changed, but you don't have the full picture yet. The next day, I arrived early and sat on one of the benches watching people go by. This time I didn't feel that tingle of a date, but something heavier, like a doctor's appointment where you don't know what diagnosis you're going to get. Luca arrived on time, but different. There was no open smile or attempt at a kiss. He sat across from me with his back straight, his hands clasped. His face had no trace of the enthusiasm he used to talk to me with before the interview. I looked at him, waiting for him to just spit it out, whether they had accepted him or not, thinking the worst he could tell me was that they hadn't hired him. I wasn't prepared for anything else. When he opened his mouth, he didn't start by talking about how they had received him or the questions they had asked. He threw a sentence at me that left me stuck to the bench. He asked me if the company he had gone to belonged to Alejandro's family. For a second, I thought I had misheard him. I felt a chill run down my spine. I asked, almost by reflex, "Why are you saying that? What does that have to do with anything?" He just held my gaze with a mix of reproach and weariness I had never seen in him. He said he needed me to be honest, that there was no point in me continuing to pretend I didn't know. In that instant, all the artificial separation I had placed between my life with Alejandro and my life with Luca came crashing down. I started to remember stray comments from Alejandro about his dad's company, about meetings, about projects. I realized I had never asked for the name of the company where Luca was going to interview. To me, it was just a big company. And that was it. I went blank for a few seconds, unable to answer him, neither yes nor no. The connection I had never wanted to see was drawing itself in front of me, and for the first time, I began to suspect that this interview hadn't just been any interview. Luca didn't need me to answer to continue. He told me he was going to explain what had happened anyway, that there was no turning back now. His voice sounded controlled, but far from the sweet tone he used in cafes. I understood that the important thing was no longer whether I confirmed the link or not, but how he had experienced that moment without knowing who I really was to the other side of the story. It was the first time since the party that I saw myself through the eyes of someone who was paying concrete consequences for something that for me was still just a phrase in a room with loud music. Comments from Update 2. Anonymous User 1 says, even when Luca disappears for a whole day after a crucial interview, your first reaction is to feel offended because he doesn't write to you, as if his priority should be to keep you calm. It doesn't occur to you that maybe he's in shock dealing with a major blow. Everything goes through the filter of how it makes you feel. OP's response. Someone being in shock doesn't prevent them from sending a one-line message. I have my life and my own things too. I'm not here to guess eternal silences. Obviously, I was worried, but when the hours pile up and there's not a single sign, it's normal to feel left out. I'm not a robot that only understands the other person's side. I also have limits with that kind of disappearance. Anonymous User 2 says, you say you weren't prepared for anything more than a no, but you ignore that you yourself created a scenario where there was much more at stake than a simple negative answer. You never asked for the name of the company or connected the dots because it was convenient for you to keep everything in compartments. That ignorance isn't innocent, it's chosen. OP's response. It wasn't a chosen ignorance, as it sounds. I just don't go around documenting every business detail about people. He talked about a big company, an opportunity, and I focused on the human part, on what it meant for him. The fact that it later turned out to be exactly Alejandro's circle is an unfortunate crossover, but not something I could control. I'm not going to pretend to be a corporate network analyst just so I'm not accused of choosing not to know later. Anonymous User 3 says, the moment Luca asks you about the company, what shocks you isn't so much the harm they've done to him, but that your watertight compartment breaks. That's when you realize your version of it was just a phrase no longer holds up. And yet, even now you tell the story focusing on how you felt sitting on the bench, not on what it meant for him. OP's response. Obviously, it hit me from my own perspective because that's where I experienced everything. I'm not denying it was hard for him. I'm just telling how the blow landed on me when I understood there were more layers. Me describing my part doesn't erase his. If it's about finding a single culprit, it's clear everyone prefers to point at me because it's more convenient than accepting that several adults made decisions in that chain. Update 3. Luca began to tell me about the interview with a precision that made me feel as if I were sitting there in the same room. He said that at first, everything had been normal. They had received him at reception. They had offered him water. An assistant took him to a large office where an older man in a suit greeted him formally. They reviewed his resume, talked about his experience, about why he had decided to come to the country, about his skills. He told me he felt quite confident that the answers were flowing, that even the interviewer had smiled a couple of times. Up to that point, everything matched the image of opportunity he had been selling me from the beginning. According to him, the turn came almost at the end. He said the interviewer looked at the resume again attentively, fell silent for a moment, and then looked up with a different, harsher expression. He asked him if he remembered a recent party, mentioned the venue, the birthday, the loud music. Luca said yes, that he had been there. Then the man asked him if he knew a girl with my name, described me physically, even mentioned I was wearing a tight dress. Luca, without understanding the context, replied yes, that he knew me, that we had met at that party. That's when, according to what he told me, the interviewer introduced himself with his full name. He said he was Alejandro's father, that the party had been organized by a friend of his son's, and that Alejandro had gone accompanied by his girlfriend. He explained that his son had come home very upset after the party, that he had told him that some guy had been all over his girlfriend all night while he was standing right next to her, that the girlfriend had even gone so far as to introduce him as her best friend to erase him from the equation. Luca said that at that moment, he felt the blood drain from his face, that he suddenly understood that this scene was the same one he had experienced from the other side, but with incomplete information. Alejandro's father, according to Luca's account, didn't raise his voice or insult him. He simply said that knowing that, he found it impossible to trust his judgment, that if someone was capable of flirting with another person's partner in front of their eyes in a context where the disrespect was so blatant, he wasn't the type of person he wanted in his company handling decisions. He told him he appreciated his time, that he wasn't going to continue with the process, and that he recommended he look for opportunities elsewhere. That phrase, look for opportunities elsewhere, which for anyone else might sound like a standard rejection, for Luca was practically the door slamming shut in his face in terms of his visa, money, and future. While he was telling me this, I oscillated between feeling that what Alejandro's father had done was a disproportionate punishment and understanding that from his perspective, he was defending his son. I tried to cling to the idea that personal matters shouldn't be mixed in a job interview, that it was unfair for him to pay for something that in the end had been a dynamic between Alejandro and me. But Luca wasn't in the mood for those kinds of nuances. He told me that if he had known from the first minute that Alejandro was my boyfriend, he never would have approached me that way. That he flirted because I played at being available, because I myself eliminated the word from the equation that would have made him change his behavior. You could see his contained anger. He said he not only felt humiliated by the way he was rejected, but also deceived by me. Because in that office, in front of that man, he understood that he was the only one who didn't know the full story. To them, I was the girl who denied her boyfriend. To him, until that moment, I had been his salvation in a new country. He told me the worst part hadn't been not getting the job, but realizing that the entire castle of possibilities he had built here was based on a version of me that wasn't real. I tried to defend myself as best I could. I told him that Alejandro shouldn't have taken the issue home, that his father had been unfair in judging him for something he didn't know in detail, that he hadn't even bothered to ask for his version. I said that in the end, the decision about the contract was the father's sole responsibility, that he was the one who had chosen to punish someone for something he hadn't even witnessed. Deep down, I needed Luca to see that not all the weight could fall on me, that I had made a mistake, yes, but that others had chosen what to do with that information. Luca listened, but didn't soften. He told me he could understand a father protecting his son even if he didn't agree with the methods, that in fact, if he were in Alejandro's shoes, it would have also hurt him to see someone flirting with his partner, and that for that very reason. He was sure that the main problem was me. He said I had lied to both of them, to Alejandro by denying him at the party, and to him by hiding the true nature of that relationship. That if I had said from the beginning that I had a boyfriend, none of this would be happening because he would have known where to stand. To finish, he blurted out that in this story, I was the common link between the broken relationship and the broken future, that he wasn't willing to take on someone like that. At that moment, I felt the ground shift, but not because I suddenly thought he was entirely right, but because I understood that my room for maneuver had shrunk. I was no longer in the comfortable position of rearranging the narrative to make it sound less serious. I had a man in front of me who had lost his key opportunity and who was holding a mirror up to my face. Even so, my reflection was still that of someone who believed that everyone else had greatly exaggerated a gesture that I still considered minimal in origin. Comments from Update 3. Anonymous User 1 says, the account of the interview makes it clear that Alejandro's father acted out of family loyalty, like it or not. In contrast, you, who claim to love Alejandro so much and support Luca, were the only one loyal only to your ego. They moved according to their values, you according to your need to feel desired. OP's response. Family loyalty isn't synonymous with justice. Just because a father wants to protect his son doesn't give him the right to use his professional power to punish third parties, much less without letting them explain themselves. I may have made bad decisions, but that doesn't automatically turn everyone else into saints. Everyone did what they wanted with the information they had, and I'm stuck with being the easiest one to point fingers at. Anonymous User 2 says, you say the father punished someone for something he didn't witness, but you conveniently forget that you also didn't see what happened after the party. You just assume everything was exaggerated because it's convenient for you to see it that way. The difference is that he trusted his son's word. You didn't even trust the bond you claimed to have with Alejandro. OP's response. Trusting someone doesn't mean giving them blank checks for their emotions to dictate the future of others. I don't deny that Alejandro felt bad. What I question is that it became a hiring criterion. If we're going to talk about trust, we could also say that Alejandro never trusted that I could explain things to him later. He preferred to leave. But hardly anyone talks about that. Anonymous User 3 says, Luca sums it up well. You lied to both of them. You erased one as a boyfriend. To the other, you hid who that best friend really was. It's not just a one-off mistake, it's a chain of decisions where you always chose what gave you more room to play. The problem is that this time, the room had consequences you couldn't cover up. OP's response. Putting it in terms of a lie sounds very clean in theory, but in practice, things aren't experienced with that absolute clarity. At the party, I reacted in seconds with noise, people, alcohol, not in an ethics lab. With Luca, the relationship with Alejandro was already de facto broken, no matter how much there wasn't a formal closing speech. The fact that everyone is now reviewing the story with a magnifying glass is fine for judging, but it doesn't reflect how it was lived in real time. Update 4. After that conversation in the square, there was no more room for nuances with Luca. He told me that without that job, his situation in the country was becoming unsustainable. He had no family here. His savings were limited, his visa had an expiration date. He explained that he could try to look for other options, but that nothing compared to that opportunity, neither in stability nor in salary, and that time was not on his side. He said it without crying, without beating his chest, simply describing a scenario he had already given up on. Every sentence he uttered was a reminder that for him, my game at the party and my silence afterward had not been mere details. I tried to steer the conversation towards us. I told him we could look for alternatives, that not everything depended on one company, that there were more places to apply, that maybe this was a sign he should take another path. It sounded nice in words, but even I felt they were empty phrases in the face of the practical magnitude of the problem. Luca listened to me, but he didn't budge an inch. He said he saw no point in continuing with me if every time he looked around, he would remember that he had lost his main opportunity because of something I had caused and minimized, that he didn't want to build anything with someone he would have to thank for not ruining more things for him. At one point, almost out of self-protection, I started to accuse Alejandro directly. I said that in the end, he was the one who had decided to take the issue home, that it was his pride that had triggered everything, that no one had forced him to tell his father the scene in such detail. I threw strong words about how it was clear that both of them were classists who preferred to punish a foreigner without a network rather than examine how perfect their own family was. I later wrote a very long message to Alejandro, throwing all those accusations at him, saying he had destroyed someone's opportunity just to feel avenged, that he had shown exactly the type of person he was. Alejandro never replied. No audio, no text, nothing. The only thing I knew about him was from mutual friends who told me that when they mentioned the matter to him, he simply said he had done nothing more than tell the truth at home, that if I had presented myself as single, he couldn't be expected to cover that up. They say he added that if Luca had known I was his girlfriend, he wouldn't have even approached me, and that's why the problem wasn't him or his father, but me and the way I had behaved. Hearing that infuriated me and at the same time left me without a reaction. I knew that from the outside, it was much easier to buy that version than mine. Luca, for his part, distanced himself quickly. He told me that in a week he would be leaving the country because he had no more time and that he preferred not to complicate things with long goodbyes. He said he didn't want to see me anymore, receive messages, or have to deal with attempts at explanation. In front of me, he took out his phone, opened our conversation, and blocked me. It was a dry scene with no apparent drama, but it carried an enormous specific weight. Not so much because it broke my heart, but because it left me in a place that was difficult to escape from, the person because of whom someone was getting on a plane without having achieved what they came for. Over time, I found out that he had indeed left. I saw one last story of his at the airport with a suitcase and a phrase in English about learning who you mess with. After that, absolute silence. I didn't know if he got a job back there, if he went back to school, if he rebuilt his life. The only thing left of him in my life was that floating idea that in his story, I must be the mistake one warns oneself about. Alejandro also moved on. I started to hear that he was dating someone from his work, that he avoided places where he knew I might appear, that his life went on without needing to cross paths with me. Among the people who knew the whole story, my name became attached to the anecdote. I was the one who denied her boyfriend at the party, and that's why they shot down the other guy's interview. Some told it with morbid curiosity, others with a warning tone, as if I were an example of what happens when you play with fire. And although inside I kept telling myself it was unfair to reduce my whole person to one night and one phrase, the truth is that in many conversations, I preferred to keep using the same simplified version as always, that my parents, my friends, everyone had gotten offended over a silly thing at a party, and that a resentful father had taken something that wasn't a big deal too personally. Sometimes, when I pass by the building of Alejandro's father's company or when I hear someone talk about visas and interviews abroad, I get a knot in my stomach. Not so much because of them as people, but because of what that night ended up representing. My impulse to feel desired by a gorgeous guy at a party ended up chaining together the breakup of a relationship and the collapse of a life plan that wasn't mine. But even with that discomfort, the story I know how to tell best, the one I use to protect myself, is still that of the misunderstood girl who just wanted to have fun and ran into people who decided to turn her phrase into a disproportionate punishment. Comments from Update 4. Anonymous User 1 says, "It's striking that when Luca blocks you and leaves, what weighs on you most isn't the harm done by his circumstances, but the place it leaves you in the narrative. You're more concerned with being the mistake in someone else's story than the fact that you pushed him to leave with nothing after he came to risk it all." OP's response. Obviously, I'm not happy that things went badly for him, but I also have the right to think about how I come out of all this. No one lives solely from guilt towards others. You also wonder what label they put on you, what place they leave you. I'm not a monster, but I'm also not going to erase my own emotions just because it's more convenient for me to be seen as the absolute villain. Anonymous User 2 says, "You keep talking about a disproportionate punishment for one phrase when the entire chain shows it wasn't just one phrase, but a sustained attitude. Denying your boyfriend, prioritizing your ego, lying by omission, minimizing consequences. The problem is you want everything to be measured by what you thought it meant, not by what it actually caused." OP's response. I'm not going to argue that my decisions had more impact than I imagined, that's clear. But between acknowledging that and accepting that everything is reduced to me ruining a life and a relationship, there's a big gap. There were many hands touching this domino, but it's easier to place all the responsibility on the one who made the first visible move. And yes, that was me, but that doesn't erase the rest of the pushes. Anonymous User 3 says, "You say you sometimes feel a knot in your stomach when passing by the company or hearing about visas, but instead of using that discomfort to truly question yourself, you only use it to reinforce the narrative that you're misunderstood. As long as you keep seeing everything as people who decided to turn my phrase into a punishment, you won't get out of the same role you've been playing since the party." OP's response. Just because something hurts me doesn't mean I have to become a voluntary martyr. I can acknowledge that there were consequences I didn't imagine while at the same time feeling that the rest also made decisions that were convenient for them. If others want to see me as the source of all evil, that's on them. I know what happened was more complex than a story of good and evil, even if the simple version is the one that circulates best.